Alright, so let's start making this cool cartoon blaster. So I started the design by going to the modeling tab, and then under mesh tools there's something called create polygon, and then in the in my top view, or actually this is the side view, I started just clicking on the grid to create the base shape. And I'm kind of doing it slow because I actually don't have a reference image. I'm just kind of thinking and inventing it as I go along. At this point I wanted to make sure that I'm only dealing with polygons that have 4 sides, so then I just took the slice knife tool and just cut the geometry to make sure each polygon has 4 or less sides. So once I created the side, the next step is going to add some thickness. So I just simply extruded the side of the mesh, and you just have to make sure you do it in the proper direction. Alright, then I just simply centered my mesh. I always like to work in the center. Next I was trying to figure out what would be the next good piece to work on. So I started on the bottom. And at this point I just wanted to make something interesting, so I began to kind of playing around with different options. So grabbing the scale on the left was creating different results than the scale that first appears when you first press the extrude button, because the one on the left is actually using the world orientation. That's why I keep switching. So then I just pulled the geometry down, and this is the bottom base of the weapon. Alright, so next I decided to work on the handle. Just keep clicking the extrude button and then the move arrow to just keep pulling the geometry out. And sometimes I know, if I know certain parts need more geometry, I don't want to keep extruding it over and over, so then I'll use the insert loops, and you will see me do that here. It's under edit mesh, mesh tools, insert edge loop, multiple edge loops, and then you can see you can quickly create extra geometry, which then you can use to kind of pull around and create a more interesting shape. So I decided to do like a little handle effect. And I thought maybe it would be more interesting if the bottom was a little bit different than the rest. Here I'm just trying to select all the points and then tilt the verts down a little bit. So it actually resembles like a handle. So I'm just turning on the wireframe in each viewport because I like to see the geometry. It helps me try to figure out what else I can pull out or modify. Alright, next I'm going to select all the edges, and you can see right now all the edges are really sharp. So I'm trying to figure out which parts of the base I kind of want to make more round. So you can see I'm just carefully selecting all the external edges, not really nothing inside, just the anything that's super sharp, like 90 degrees. And I could have had the symmetry on at this point, but I'm just kind of casually playing around. And sometimes you can select a bunch of lines and try it, and you can see that this is the bevel where you can actually control the fraction. Sometimes if you're not happy, you can just undo a bunch of times and try something else. But you could see this gives like a nice beveled edge, so it creates a much softer and more interesting shape. Even though this is super low poly, right now we're only at 219 polygons. This soft edges just give you a much better feel, I think. Alright, so now I'm just kind of beginning to extrude the front. Again, I don't have a reference image, so I'm just kind of brainstorming and trying to imagine it of what might look good. And many times I'll try a bunch of things, and then if I don't like it, I'll just undo and go back and redo. But in this case, kind of worked out. I knew I didn't want to do like a boring barrel of a blaster. I want to do some more of an energy weapon, so I'm just kind of doing more of like a fork kind of thing. I'm trying to keep changing the shapes just so they don't stay kind of the same. So every time you pull something out, maybe take a moment and see if you can change the base shape of it to create something more interesting. Here I tried to switch it to the symmetry, but it wasn't working, so then I sort of gave up. But I didn't take the time to split the mesh properly, so it's so it's symmetrical. So instead I just grabbed the 2 points and used the scale tool to kind of achieve the same exact effect, trying to pull the 2 points at the same time. Again, just playing around, making something more interesting than just plain square. I thought sharp edges looked a little more aggressive, which works really nicely for energy weapon. And in the middle, I thought it would be cool if it had some kind of an energy source. So that's what I'm working on next. And it's amazing how much complexity you can achieve by just keep going between extruding, moving and rotating and extruding, and it's just keep playing with the geometry and shapes until they're more interesting and more complex. Next, I wanted to bring a sphere to the center, but I didn't want to use a sphere, the poly modeling sphere that was available, so I made one out of cube, and this way the topology of the sphere was a little bit easier to work with as far as connecting it to other shapes. And I'm just kind of eyeballing it. I'm not really centering it too precisely to the grid or anything. I'm just kind of making sure it feels good. Now I'm interested in taking the sphere and connecting it to the middle pole. So I'm just kind of eyeing the geometry, figuring out what would be the best way to do that. So once I punched the hole through, you could see that the verts don't match. So then what I have to do is merge the verts together. So there's only four edges. And this way the 4 edges on the sphere match the 4 edges in the center that I'm trying to connect to. Just simply pressing the bridge tool to connect the 2 shapes. Alright, next I'm just gonna make the, we'll add a little more detail to the front of it, of the sphere. So this is a cool trick. You can actually select parts of it and then use the scale tool to kind of flatten it out. And here I wanted to make some kind of a barrel effect, like something that an energy can shoot out of. But then I realized I wanted it round, so I used that really cool tool in the shelf that can take all the points and kind of turn them into a circle. and then just creating the barrel. And then as you can see, again, I switched the scale on the left to make sure that my axis orientation was world instead of local. Just gives you different scaling result, and it's fun to try both to see sometimes one would work better than the other. In this next section, I decided to do 6 brackets to add more complexity, so it's not too simple looking. And that's what this next step is just creating 6 brackets going around the main barrel. And this should look really sweet once we do the UVs and bring it into Substance Painter for painting, because this whole front of the weapon would be metal, and any kind of detail with brackets or extruded detail looks really nice in Substance. So now I'm just looking at the piece and trying to figure out if I should add more detail to it before I bend it. So just like with the handle, I thought maybe it would be neat to extrude couple elements to just create a little more detail. Alright, so once I was happy with the bracket, I'm going to go ahead and bend it using the deform, non-linear deform. So you just simply click bend and then change the curvature to 90 degrees. And once you're done and you're happy, you just want to make sure you clean the history to get rid of that blue pole there. And now the shape is kind of baked in, so you can't modify it anymore, but I don't need to. Now I'm just going to take a few moments to actually align the shape. So to do that, I was kind of using literally all 4 views just to make sure that it looks nice from each direction. And as you're doing that, as long as your shape is selected, if you just press F inside any one of these viewports, it kind of zooms in and centers, which is really cool. If you press A, it will frame into all of your objects. If you press F, it will only focus on the one that you actually have selected. Again, just kind of eyeing it. Next, I pressed Ctrl D to duplicate it. And then once I duplicated it, I realized in the top view I could actually use the grid to my benefit and align them precisely. So I just took a moment to do that. You press D to switch into the pivot mode, and then you hold down the X key while dragging the arrow to snap to the grid. This way you know it's perfectly precise in distance. Then I just simply flip it with a mirror tool to the other side. And it's already looking really nice, but then I just felt like I needed a little more detail. Just literally experimenting and trying to see how stuff looks when I pull on it, and that's what happens when you don't have a reference image and you're just kind of just freestyling it. So now I'm just trying to create something more sort of aerodynamic, so it looks a little more organic and not so bulky. Almost like a fin on top. Here I selected some of the elements and combined the geometry, but then later I realized I actually didn't do it to all of them. But next I decided to add a little more shape to the handle. It looked too simple, not interesting enough. So using the soft selection is a cool way to create organic feel of the shape. You just have to figure out if you're doing the volume, it will grab all the pieces around you, and then if you do surface, it will only affect the piece that you're actually working on. So like if you have two separate pieces of geometry that are not connected and you want to affect both of them, you want to use volume, right? Because it's going to affect two or more, however many you have. But then if you only want to affect a specific one you only have selected, you must use surface for soft selection, so keep that in mind. For me at this point it actually doesn't matter because this whole backhand is one solid piece. Next I felt like the sides definitely needed something more interesting. So I manually selected both of them again instead of using symmetry. But the shape is simple enough for me to just kind of do it manually. So you see I tried the local scale, that I wasn't happy with that, so I went to the world scale and that moved all the pieces beautifully. Here I realized later I can't just simply move them, I actually have to scale them to make sure that they both go out at the same time. And I thought I'll leave this piece like this so I can make it maybe glow in Substance Painter. Maybe that could be like a part of the weapon that holds energy. Maybe electric blue or lime green energy inside the weapon. That would be cool. Beveling the edges again. I don't like to see anything sharp. And sharp things are also not very good for Substance Painter. A lot of times you'll get defects when things are just 90 degrees sharp. So that's good practice not to have that. Again, no references. I'm just kind of pulling things around to make it, to see if it's makes sense and if it looks interesting. At this point, I realized I actually don't have a trigger for my weapon, so I decided to add one. So that was kind of a cool trick. I extruded the geometry in the center, but then I moved it along the normals towards the position where the trigger needs to be. Instead of creating more edge loops, that was just a clever way to keep geometry nice and clean. And at this point I added more edge loops. Maybe I didn't need this many, because then I kind of spent a few seconds battling them. So at this point I was trying to think of where the finger would go, so maybe there's some indentation. But then the back looked kind of terrible. Again, I think I made a little bit too many points for that that part there. So now I have to spend a little extra time dealing with it. But here I added a cool little detail to the top of the trigger. So it looks like it's actually extruding from something, like it's part of the base. And you see at this point I left the local scale on instead of switching to world, so that actually served to my benefit. So you just have to figure out how you want the geometry to extrude when it comes out and see if that works. If not, you can try the world scale instead. I was just trying to figure out trying to make a softer bend. So as you can see, I'm spending a lot of time on this trigger versus other pieces. And this happens when you begin to add extra geometry, but then you have to deal with more points and so on. This is when I realized I actually didn't connect all the elements. Easy fix. At this point, it's a little trick I learned. If I go into the render settings, I can smooth the wireframe so it looks a little nicer, and as well as add some shadows with ambient occlusion right there in real time in your port. It's good for final presentation. Alright, so final 360 looks really nice. I'm happy with how it came out, and I can't wait to play with it in Substance Painter. Add some cool glows and more detail. And at the very last second I realized the bottom of the handle could actually look a little more interesting than just flat. So that's what I'm doing there. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this, the next part 2 is going to be doing UVs, and then we're going to take this guy and bring him into Substance Painter for some cool textures. All right, thanks a lot for watching.